Okay, good morning. Beis, volume 3, middle of page 1223. Aleph Resh Chov Gimel. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Okay. 3 stages in emotional maturity and emotional development, which are called the emotions themselves as Nehi, Chagas, Chabad, the 3 dimensions of behavioral emotions, emotional emotions, and cognitive emotions, which as we call them. And these are the 3 stages of Mutva, Murgish, and Muskel. In Kabbalistic terms, Ibur, Yenika, and Moichin. So we covered the first 2. Well, we're still in the middle, the second one, I'm sorry. We covered the first one, Mutva, which is the natural characteristics and the genetic code, the genetic makeup of a human being. And just as it is in the stage of Ibur, pregnancy, so is it when the child is born. You don't see and recognize these characteristics. Then comes stage 2, Murgash, or Yenika, that Yenika, through the nursing, as he mentioned, particularly through the pleasure, that develops the emotion. They begin to emerge and grow. Obviously, stage by stage, like he said, ma'at, as the child grows and develops, the emotions grow just as the body grows. So though the midas are still what he calls katnus, in a state of immaturity, and maisa nairus, and still involved in childlike matters, but you can begin to recognize the personality and the characteristics, like butzim mekatfa yediyah, as and they begin to develop. He mentioned the ages 3, 4, until it grows to maturity. And this is called murgish, because the midas are there and they're revealed and they're murgish. You can feel them both themselves and others. But there's nothing new in the actual midas, is the first point he made. It's the same characteristics, but now they're apparent, or they're beginning to emerge and become apparent. And until now, they were concealed. In the new paragraph, on page 1223, he said, it's not just that they get revealed, you also see that the midas are focused on more mature matters. A child is stimulated by small things, by immature things, by childish matters. And an adult is midas, the same midas, but their interest is in dvarim gedalim, as he put it. And he actually will not want to be involved in immature little things that a child would be interested in. Same person, the same characteristics, but the characteristics themselves, the midas, are drawn to more mature things, and he actually would be embarrassed by being involved in immature, childish things. So the Rebbe Rashab says you have to say that this is not due to the midas alone. You have to say, he says, behechrich is coming mitzad the seichel. As the child grows and the mind grows, the mind expands the horizons and the interests. So therefore the emotions are interested in more broader things, in more mature things, in more sophisticated interests. Because the midas themselves, the person hasn't changed. If a person is a rachmani, is a compassionate person, or a different personality, that doesn't change. That's part of the genetic makeup of the child, of the human being, whether they're a child or an adult. The difference is where they apply it and how they apply it. And he brings proof from an animal. You see animals who are emotional and there's no changes. No matter how old the animal is, he doesn't say those words, but the animal says, but balechayim shein tivim be'etzem husamad einim mishtana behem tivam le'elam. Their nature never changes. So when you isolate midas alone without a powerful mind, we're not talking about a mind that serves the midas, the emotions, but without an independent, objective mind, what will you have? You'll have an animal is a perfect test. The animal is not going to change, tivam. So therefore, when a person, something changes, and you see his midas are drawn to other things, he says, al koponim. We're not talking about now a fundamental change of, through Aveda, as we mentioned yesterday, through Aveda, the person works on their very personality. We're talking about al koponim, so that he wants to have more mature, more sophisticated interests that he has, is misad the seichel, that's manigas amidus, that governs and directs and guides the midas, like a moira derech, like a compass that guides the midas to the place there it should be. But on the other hand, it's still midas. We're not talking about the mind is taken over. So he says, so though the midas have not changed, they're the same so-called same ingredients are there, but the ingredients are being used to bake a more sophisticated cake, if you wish. Whereas a child would take the ingredients of his emotional characteristics and direct them toward more childish things. And that's not a critique. That's what a child does. Because a mature adult has a mind, the same midas, even though betal dasam, they're the same, hanhaga shalhem hu ayidei seichel. The seichel will direct the midas in bekadlus or begadlus. And then he adds, the im kain, gam tchilas eseres amidu ayidei seichel. Which, as I suggested yesterday, most likely means that for an adult, a child is controlled primarily by emotions. The mind is not yet mature enough. There's a mind, but it's not really the mind that's defining the emotion. But by an adult, not only is the midah guided by the emotions, it's awakened by the mind. Not only is it guided by the mind, rather, it's also, he says, in other words, the self-control of the mind in a mature person is not just guiding emotions. Like, you have an emotion, it tells you where to take it. But it also guides it from its inception, that the midas themselves are being awakened, because a mature mind is going to conceive and contemplate on things, and the emotions will follow in due course and guided by that mind. And it continues to qualify. And though we learned all this yesterday, I'm just summing it up, that even though the midah is still innate, inherent to him, in his nature, he's a chazdan, an oyev, a kind person and a loving person, or the opposite, as he says, ragzim v'seina. So he says, this is the difference. Yes, the midas does not change, but that's the difference between less mature and more mature. The bekatnus say this amidu rak mitzad hatva. So now he's adding another important nuance here, more than a nuance, another point, that in addition to the fact that the mind guides the midas, what maturity means is that the midas have another factor that's influencing that. By a child, all that's influencing is impulse, whatever that emotional impulse may be. He says, Hamida Hirak mitzad hatva, ubegadlus hayseris mitzad haseichel. So for a child, what mostly drives a child is an emotional reaction. Like I mentioned, you give a child a gift, it smiles. You take away a toy, the child cries. Its reactions are very impulsive and very subjective. That's the emotions of katnus. When it comes to a mature person, the emotion hasn't changed. The person is still, if he's a kind person, he's a kind person from childhood to adulthood. But now the seichel becomes a factor in how the emotions express themselves and how the emotions even are stimulated. In other words, an adult is not going to allow them on an impulse to just control them. We're talking about obviously an adult that's a true adult. So if someone does something the child doesn't like, the child will begin to cry. An adult, someone does something that the adult doesn't like, you may not like it, but you're not going to let your emotions take control of you. You let the seichel determine and reflect, and then you have a plan of action. If the action requires an emotional reaction, it'll include that. In other words, the maturity is not just that the seichel, you become a smarter person, but actually the midas grow as the seichel develops as well, because the seichel is guiding them. That's what he said, it's a murder there. The seichel speaks to the midas. Even though the actual emotion that's awakened is going to follow the nature. Oh, actually, I think that's where we stopped, I believe. I'm just looking. No. We read a few more lines. So even though, and here he goes, the back and forth, is it a midah or is it seichel? So the truth is a midah. We're talking about an emotional reaction. So the mind is not going to tell a person, don't be a kind person. If by nature we're wired genetically from birth, like he said, in the first level, mutva, that you're a chazdan, you're a kind person, the mind is not going to change that and say, okay, now you're no longer kind, you're going to be not kind. But the mind will tell you how to use your kindness. The mind will also tell you, like a child may be kind and actually be kind to someone that is not worthy, or kind in a way that can end up hurting the child, because the child is a kind child. Where an adult will still be kind, the same kind person, but seichel will be guiding and seasoning and directing it. So he says, the actual midah, the midas don't change fundamentally. I'm skipping the parentheses. I'll get back to it in a minute. But its awakening, its stimulation is due to seichel, through the seichel. That's where we stopped. So what does the parentheses add? I said I would elaborate a bit more. He says something else interestingly. In addition to the fact that the emotions have particular personality, the same thing is with the mind. We see children genetically inherit sometimes the parents' approach to things, their mind, the way they think, the way they conceive ideas. The mind also has a genetic structure. So he says, "Gam atiyas haseichel k'fi hatfo mipnei shorsha b'ashrosha atzmis." So the mind also has that. Like when you say Shammai and Hillel, Gvura and Chesed, or Hillel and Shammai, Chesed and Gvura, their neshamas were, this one leaned more towards Chesed, more leniency. That was Hillel. And Shammai was more stringent, more Gvura, which would affected their way of thinking. Not that it distorted their way of thinking, because they're both Torah people, but that was their leaning, their inclination. That's Hillel would find the more lenient side to things, and Shammai would find the other opposite extreme, the more severe approach. Both again, apitera, not anyone, God forbid, did something wrong. So you see, the mind also has its tendencies. Now he's adding that because it just adds to the whole picture that though the mind is objective and it can guide the emotions, it's also important to note that the mind also has its genetic structure of how it works. It's not relevant fundamentally to our conversation here, because here the main point is being made is that the midas are going through development and maturity, and the mind has an impact. But it's an interesting footnote, so to speak. That's a parenthesis, just to add that. Now, you can ask the question, okay, let's say Hillel's mind is more chesedic. Now, the mature Hillel, obviously that chesed affected also his emotions. When that potential convert comes to Shammai, teach me the whole Torah standing on one foot, Shammai sends him away. You can't do that. And for legitimate reason. But Shammai's mind was always a sharper, more discretionary, and so on. Hillel said, that which you dislike, don't do unto others. They both had a Torah approach. So you can see that the mind also impacted their behavior, where Hillel behaved in a more lenient way, in a more kiruvdika way. Again, without disqualifying and in any way disparaging Shammai's approach. It's two different approaches. Okay. That's a summary. So now we'll continue. He's going to continue to explain this. He says, Dihina oneroyim, because now we see bechush, we actually see, bechush means something that you can tangibly see. Shagam midas hativim, that also the natural emotions, to love something or to like something, to be attracted to something that's good, a good thing, whatever it may be. And to despise or loathe and to be repulsed and avoid something that from a bad thing, umazik, and destructive, bad and destructive. That's also dependent on the mind, seichel, intelligence and das within in the mind. The kashay is, in other words, what determines when a person is attracted to something or not? You need the mind, he's going to explain. The kashay is beinim bedavar hateva nehava nehav be'echus tuve be'etzem. When a person contemplates and thinks about something and sees that this thing is good and beloved in its quality, it's a qualitatively good thing. Be'echus tuve be'etzem, in the qualitative fundamental good of this thing, whatever it may be. You have an option, for instance, to help somebody, and you don't know whether it's worthy of help, but then you look into the situation and your mind says, yes, this is a very important cause to help out, or something that you're attracted to. Not everything we're attracted to is good, but once you contemplate and you look into it and you research, you do your due diligence, and you come to realize this thing is fundamentally good. And not only is good, it's also good for you. You could say it's good, as we've learned, but you don't yet determine that it's good for you. But it's also tev loy hadover. So what does that contemplation do? That research, the mind has determined that it's a good thing, and it's also good for you. Then in his heart will awaken and stimulate and arouse to be drawn to it with an attraction and a passion. And the more he invests, the more he delves deeper with his thought, the more he concentrates. Hafloga means like abundant, with an expanded or exorbitant is sometimes the word. The abundance, a very much, the hafloga satev, I'm looking for another word, expansive good, broadened hafloga. Right, mufloga is more than just much. It's like overflowing. Mufloga means it should be beyond the regular measure.
No boundaries.
Okay. Huh?
No boundaries.
Yeah. So the more he concentrates with his thought, in that expansive and the overabundant, the flowing or flourishing good. Maybe flourishing is a good word here. So the more he focuses on it, the more he concentrates, the more he contemplates on the goodness of it, the more excited, the more his heart gets aroused and excited with a love, with an attraction. And now we use the word shuki yeseda. Before he said chemda, passion, shuka is a yearning, a longing. So we see from this so far the mind's role in the awakening of this emotion. Now he goes, and what happens? He wants to also say the other side. If he does not focus or concentrate, maimik means depth, means he's investing his mind, he's delving his mind. And he doesn't contemplate that much on the quality, on the essential quality of this good and beloved thing. So in direct proportion to that, just as when he does contemplate, that causes more of awakening of that emotion and that attraction. When he doesn't, his heart won't be that excited. In a love and a chukka, in an attraction and a yearning, kol kach. It'll be more cold and aloof and more superficial, more on a surface level. He's not saying, in other words, there won't be any attraction, but it'll be more superficial, more surface level, more detached, more cool and collected. Kridus means cold, but it also means aloof. It means more detached, basically. But Kridus is more apathetic or indifferent. Upechetzenius, more superficial. To the extent, Rebbe Rashab is really elaborating on this example. To the extent that when he distracts himself, when he stops thinking about it, yasiach daite means to distract or to move away, and you're thinking about something else. You're no longer thinking about this. Yasiach daite machshavte legamri, completely. Ma'adover hazeh. In other words, he talked about delving into it and even deeper. Then he talked about just not that much. Now he's saying to the point that you're completely not thinking about it any longer. Ma'adover hazeh, from this thing that was a good thing. Lo yispal. Next page, 1224. Belibe klal adover hazeh. He won't at all be enticed or excited about this thing. Enticed is another good word here. Even though he sees it right before him, it could be standing right there near him. He sees it from close up. And if you looked only at the emotions themselves, on paper, it would make sense this person should be attracted to it. And nevertheless, it's as if it doesn't exist. He's not drawn to it at all. Why? Because he's not thinking about it. You see this all the time. Something very valuable and precious. So when you think about it, you appreciate it. The more you think about it, the more you're drawn and more passionate, the more being longing for it. The less you think, the less excitement, to the point you can be bechitzeni, superficial. But if you're not thinking about it, it could be right before you and you ignore it as if it doesn't have any value to you at all. Even though if you did think about it, you'd suddenly appreciate what you have before you. How many times have we had things in our lives, beautiful things, and we just didn't pay attention? We ignored it. We were distracted. We were busy with other things. And then later you find out you're standing right near one of the most precious things you could have. It happens all the time. What do we see from this? That the mind is vital in this emotional interaction. In other words, just because you're a kind person and right before you is something that you would do naturally, you'd be kind, but you're ignoring it because whatever reason you're busy with something else. So you see the mind's role. Where he's going with this, we shall see. But you see how the mind plays a role in the mind doesn't create and does not define the emotion, because the emotion is part of who you are, but the mind clearly has a role, not just in guiding, but also making you aware that this is something where your emotion would be attracted to, and it's worthwhile investing in. You hear many times stories, people who did not want to go see the Rebbe, whatever reason. And then when they did, they said, I can't believe I resisted seeing something so valuable. So many times, whatever reason it is, we could have something that we would really love, but you didn't allow yourself, or you were distracted, or something blocked you from being able to appreciate it. And then you appreciate it not because you were convinced. Your emotions react because it's something that really draws you. But he's continuing to elaborate on this. So this is Ava. Now he's going to say the same thing as with Yira. Remember, we talk about Ava as attraction and being drawn to something. Yira is avoiding something, or respect for something, awe, as we learned before, that when you love God, you do what he wants you to do. You want to be close to him, but you also want to avoid things that he doesn't like. It's like when you love your beloved, if you're really drawn, you also avoid things. So he's going to explain now, v'chenu biyira hativis. Just as we spoke, Ava hativis, the natural love and attraction that a person has in their midas, there's also yira hativis, mutva. Sheteva adam lira mekol davar hara umazik lenafshe. The nature of a person is to be, okay, you can use the word frightened even here. Lira, to stay away from, avoid everything that's evil, and mazik lenafshe, that's dangerous. Look at a person, fire. When we see fire, we're always careful. Or other things that could be damaging. We may not know it's damaging, but if we know it's damaging, and not just are we frightened that we avoid it, but we actually despise it to the core. Betachlis means utterly. We utterly avoid, utterly loathe or despise it. Limes means to hate, but it's not really the best word here. Is more despise or be turned off by betachlis, something that's destructive. Now here too, it's dependent on the mind. Now he's using hafloga the other way around. The more he delves with his mind and his concentration in what I say, I don't want to say the word flourishing, but in the overflowing quality and the personality of how bad this thing is, hafloga yeseda, with an additional hafloga yeseda, not just overflowing, but abundant overflow. No, it's really bad, something really, really bad. So in direct proportion to how much you focus and concentrate on how bad that thing is, that's how the hispailas hayira, the stimulation of your avoidance or your pachad, you're frightened even, fear. Yeah, he does say pachad, yira pachad. Both your fear and your fright will also be yesed to the point that it will reach to the depths of your heart. In other words, your whole heart will be literally trembling. It doesn't say the word trembling, but it means it will pierce and completely affect you, consume your heart. Like we see, even in real time, if you're frightened by something, you walk in the street and you see something that's dangerous, or some other thing that you see right away, and the more you think about it, you say, oh boy, this is not a good situation. What do you think happens? A person becomes consumed with that emotional fear. I'm talking even on a very basic level. We're not even talking now ruchnius. Obviously, in Avodas Hashem, this requires hisbanunus, because you don't need much to know when there's a criminal or there's a murderer, God forbid, or someone, a dangerous the terrorist or destructive person or element. But in Avodas Hashem, it's going to require the contemplation to know this thing is not good for you, because we don't see it with our naked eye. Just pointing that out. But if you do contemplate and you come to that conclusion, then you moyes, like you see in Perik Yud of Tanya, he says that tzaddik, gomer she'ena gomer, moyes bedavar hara. He doesn't just avoid it. He despises it because it's opposite of what God is. Anything opposite of godliness or devoid of godliness, like a tzaddik would also hate golus. He hates golus. He's not just detached. He hates it. Now, when I say hate, obviously we don't mean hate, consumed with hate in a negative way. It means anything that's not godly, this person despises, because they're so connected to what is healthy. So anything unhealthy is something that you loathe. Okay.
He's talking about physical fear, like you're going in a wall.
That's good. But and here too, the other way around. And the more he does not concentrate his mind or delve in it with his thought and his das, lo yispal b'yira kol kach. Mam is the same thing like he spoke before with Ava. His yira will not be that stimulated. The lo yifachid kol kach, and he won't fear as much. To the point that he can push it aside from his heart altogether and be oblivious to this danger. And if he moves his mind away from it, meaning he completely distracts himself, and he eliminates it from his heart, in other words, he eliminates this fear from his heart, it could be that he could be standing close to a lion, or listim, or to thieves, criminals. And he will not be at all afraid, because he's not even thinking about it. So here he's clearly talking about actual fright and fear in a physical sense of the word. So we see here, he's going to continue, but we see here that he's speaking the same idea, both in being attracted to something that's healthy and loving and good for you, and the opposite of something that's dangerous. brings a raya from Behilchus Melochim, Perek Zayin, Halacha Tezvav. The Rambam, chapter 7, Halacha 15, says, V'chol hamachsel lachshe v'laharer b'milchama. And everyone who begins to think, laharer is sometimes a deeper type of thought. Machshav and Hirur are two levels of thought. B'milchama. So he's talking here at Hilchos Melachim, he's talking about those that are worthy and how you go out to war and how you wage war. So anyone who begins to think about it, umavil atzmei, and frightens himself. He mavil means shocks himself. In other words, he's going out to war and he's not focusing on the bloodshed and all the things that frighten him. Over beleisaseh. He's talking about, of course, a melchamas mitzvah, melchamas reshus. But when you go out melchama, you can't be yare v'rach levav. It's a posuk. You can't be frightened and weak of heart. Because the whole way you can succeed in war is when you're strong-hearted and you're confident and you're driving ahead. If you're going to be completely overwhelmed with fright, you're not going to be very effective. You'll even be a liability. So here he's saying, you're over beleisaseh, shenemer al yarech levavchem v'al tiro. That you should not have weak, rach is soft, or weak heart, and you should not be afraid. It's a pasuk. And those that are supposed to not go to war. It says clearly in the pasuk that if someone is yarev rach levav, someone's afraid and a soft heart and is unable to deal with the challenges and the difficulties and the harshness of war, they shouldn't go to war. So this clearly, the Rambam says, he connects it to Hirur, Machshava and Hirur. He doesn't just say a person is frightened. He's saying, in other words, you're bringing on the fright by thinking about it, concentrating about it. Because the fear is dependent on Dafke, it's specifically dependent on focus and concentration of your mind. And if he removes his mind from it, he thinks about other things and doesn't focus on it, he won't be afraid. Which actually is one of the methods that you teach people, or you train them. It's a lot of training, that even they're in a situation that can be a frightening situation, their minds don't focus on it, and you focus on victory or other things, different methods to keep you focused on the positive and not allow yourself to become overwhelmed by the fear. Now, of course, obviously, when you're standing in front of a lion or thieves or criminals, it's not the point then that you should be masir das. He's just using that as an example. He's not saying that's good. In war, it's halacha and adin and teira and so on. But that doesn't mean in every situation we should be avoiding. On the other hand, when you have situations, I was just talking to someone yesterday. I said, how could you not, he listens to my classes, how could you not be frightened with everything that's going on? Anti-Semitism and here and there. The truth is, there's much, if you start focusing and listening to all the bad news, and I'm not talking about even the fake news, I'm talking about real news, and that's what you focus on, it's true. But I learned from the Rebbe that even though things sometimes weren't positive, there was always that attitude, we're not going to be focused and be afraid. What was the Rebbe's approach when Scuds, or there were terrorist attacks, or the wars in Israel? Always the Rebbe said, it's the safest place, don't be afraid. But there's Scuds, there are missiles, there's a war being fought. In every country, when a war is fought, they tell the citizens or they tell visitors to leave. The Rebbe was not being not realistic. He understood that. But he also said, there's God is watching the land. Obviously, that's the key, the betachin. The frightening things, don't focus on that. How many letters you find from the Rebbe? Masir das, based on Tanya, Perek Beis. Something is frightening you. You have to move your mind to something else. You can't be focusing, ultimately, which will lead to paranoia and fear and fright. The point upon him here is not so much that point. The point is that the midas are all influenced by the seichel. So ava v'yira, you have natural ava and yira within you, but that doesn't mean that has to be activated. It could also be without the seichel, it could remain dormant. Yes, and if the seichel does focus on it, you awaken the midah, and if the seichel doesn't focus, the midah gets weaker to the point that you can completely ignore and be unaware, like he said, both in the positive side of attraction and ava, and the negative side of yira and repulsion. So he
There is an
continues.
answer from the Rabbi to somebody, the Ho'iker, Lasiach daitoi fun sich, al kol ponim eze shavuos.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lasiach daitoi fun sich.
Right. Correct. So now he says, Hare. So what do we derive from all of this? Shagam Yiseiris Hamidus, Hare. Shagam Yiseiris Hamidus Tivim, that also the awakening of natural midas, Toli B'Seichel V'Das Dafke, is dependent explicitly Dafke, on Seichel and Das. So, Ubemela, and therefore, it's natural. How you say it, Ubemela, and therefore, inevitably, so the awakening and the stimulation of the emotions is according to what the seichel compels, what the seichel determines. Because this is what the seichel does in magbil, in containing the emotion, and machlish, and weakening the emotion. The midah on its own, like when a child, due to the pure natural inclination, the natural wiring, the midah on its own would be intense, in an increased intensity. But when the midah is stimulated and awakened through the seichel's direction, the seichel's compelling case and argument, then the midah will follow and only go as much as the seichel directs it to go, as much as the seichel compels the case for it. I'll explain in a moment. We'll give a good example. Of course, there's a child and adult, but I want to just finish the piece, and then we'll explain, and then I'll stop for any questions. And this means Shemitzad ha'tfa hamida be'etzem he bechumri is be'yeser. He's now explaining this. He's analyzing it. This means that the midah on its own, in its core, is bechumri is be'yeser. Chumrius here means it's in its rawest. Raw is the right word here. Sometimes chumrius means crass, coarse. It could even mean grobkeit. Now, it's all correct. It's all possible to determine, but I think the best is the raw. And therefore, it's in its crassest form. It's in its raw form because it's not been polished. It's like any midah can also go very wild. It needs to be tamed, and needs to be contained, and needs to be harnessed properly. So the midah on its own, in other words, mutva, the natural wiring, the midah is bechum is b'yeser. Ukasher himitzad seichel. But then, when the midah is being guided or being born through seichel, born meaning stimulated and awakened through seichel, harihu bedakus. It's refined. Because the seichel is making sure that the midah. So, for example, let's go back to the example of fright. There's something that right before you seems to be very frightening. And the more you think about it, the more it's frightening. Comes the and the seichel goes that direction. But then comes the seichel and says, 1 second here. Yes, it's a challenging situation, but there are ways around it. Like in war, you develop a strategy, how you're going to deal with the enemy. So the seichel doesn't just allow the impulsive emotion where a person's just frightened by something. It actually guides it, and it can turn the emotion into a positive. So we use the fright to be careful, but in a way that doesn't overwhelm you, where you become completely overwhelmed with fright. So a child on its own, the emotions are going to be very raw, based on the child's impulsive reaction. Seichel will refine it and shape it to a point where it's also healthier for you, both in the positive, what to be attracted to, and also what to stay away from. For example, a child may not be afraid of certain things, and the adult will come and say, you're right now in a dangerous place. The seichel says, no. To you, it appears everything is nice, but if you use your seichel, you suddenly realize, no, right now we need midas hayira, because it's not a safe place to be. So So seichel takes a natural midah, whatever it may be, and turns it into something that's more refined. Or not just takes it, also can stimulate it that way. Because when you focus on something that's good and you develop an attraction to it, so the midah now is coming in a very healthy way. The seichel has done its legwork, so to speak, its due diligence. It's prepared the ground. And now the midah can come and live up to its fullest and healthiest way because the seichel has, so to speak, prepared. It's just like any research you do. Someone suggests a shidduch for your child. So you don't just say yes or no. You do research. You use your mind. Then you hear good things about that person. And you say, you know what? I'm being drawn and attracted. Not saying the person is ready for marriage. But you say to your son or your daughter, it seems like a very good prospect here. A very good idea, suggestion. So your seichel has directed. If you just go by impulses, you could end up with someone that you shouldn't, that is not, is really not right match. Or the other way around. Without using your seichel, you could also just reject someone without thinking about it and just say, oh, I don't like what they look like. When in truth is you should have done a little more research. Just to use examples, practical examples. U'kamoishin is bar le'il, as we learned earlier, Dibra Maslo Atem Netzovim Hagimel. The third Atem Netzovim. In the bottom they say in volume 2, page 1139, Dateva hi chumri. That in general, anything that is just natural in its natural form is always raw and undeveloped. Like anything. Many foods that need to be processed, or they need, you can't just eat raw grain. You need to process it. You need to refine it. The same thing with many different things that need a refinement process. But tevat on its own is chumri. In that sense, raw, undeveloped. You could even say crass. And yeah. The zeu klolos hahefresh, and now he brings it back to Aveda. This is the general difference between the divine soul and the animal soul. The nefesh habamis, the animal soul, li is TV be'etzem, because it's fundamentally and at its core a natural entity. Nefesh habamis is the natural soul within us that's about survival, like the animal, biological survival, and it follows its impulses. Harihu chumri. Therefore, on its own, it's raw and crass, without the direction. The only thing that will drive it is whatever is good for itself. It sees something it likes, is drawn to it without thinking much, and so on. The parenthesis he adds, it's qualifying. The nefesh halikis is also in a state of katnus by a child. I'll explain in a minute. So the nefesh halikis also, when it's still in its immature state, meaning in a child, there are also the natural faculties, which are drawn to the crassness of the animal soul. Okay. So the explanation here says in other Maimorim, you may have heard the expression that the nefesh habamis comes in earlier in a human being than the nefesh halikis. Now, when we say comes in, doesn't mean physically comes in, because the nefesh halikis is there right in the beginning of conception, just like the divine soul and the animal soul. As a matter of fact, it says in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe brings that by a bris, and the Rebbe says the same as by the naming of a girl, is the ascholas, the knisas nefesh halikis. It's the beginning of the entry of the divine soul. Chassidus says that agdemet tainise, the nefesh habamis came with a complaint. If the nefesh halikis is going to be just as strong as I am, from beginning of the child development, I'll never have a fighting chance. So the Eibishter made it this way. Obviously, it wasn't a complaint. It was the way it was set up in the first place. that the nefesh habamis will be the more controlling force in the early childhood years. And even though the nefesh halikis enters at the bris, but gemar knisas nefesh halikis says is by the bar mitzvah. Because bar mitzvah is when the child begins to develop moichin de gadlus. Not completely yet, obviously. A 13-year-old boy or 12-year-old girl is not a fully mature intelligence, but you can already expect responsibility. That's why they're mechuyev b'mitzvahs. You can expect from a 13-year-old boy, 12-year-old girl, discipline. You can control your natural reactions, whether it's around putting on tefillin for a boy or the different things for a woman. In other words, moichin are beginning to come into play. When moichin comes more into play, the nefesh halikis is now becoming more powerful. And that's why you can expect, that's why mechuyev b'mitzvahs, till bar mitzvah and bas mitzvah, the responsibility of a child is its parent. Because the child can't be expected yet. Why? Because the natural instincts of the child are dominant. This doesn't mean a child is bad. It means that the crassness or the rawness of the emotions of the nefesh habamis are dominant. And even the nefesh halikis is not yet developed enough. So nefesh halikis is also more or less under the control of the natural instinct. That's why you'll see a 3-4-year-old child, even though hevel shem bechet, on one hand, they have no yetzer hara to big sins like adults do. But on the other hand, a child, you can't expect if a child suddenly behaves in a way that seems inappropriate, doesn't say a bracha or something like that, or is not kind, it's because the child's natural self is not developed yet. And the nefesh halikis, you can't expect the child to say, I have a nefesh habamis and nefesh halikis, and my divine soul will dominate. What he says in Tanya, is after you're an adult. And then there's a battle between the emotions where the nefesh habamis resides in the emotions of the heart, and the nefesh halikis resides in the reflective mind. There's a battle, and then you can expect. So what he's saying here is that in addition to the fact that nefesh habamis is TV, and therefore raw and crass, also the nefesh halikis, when it's in a state of katnus, in other words, the meichin of the nefesh halikis have not developed yet. So then nefesh halikis is also subject and more or less under the control, like he says, and being drawn to whatever it is the nefesh habamis is drawn. So
it doesn't mean the nefesh halikis.
Listen, I'm going to stop for questions. I insist. I'm going to stop for questions after I finish, because there are people in the class and people are distracted. So I want to keep focused. I don't want to just be a one-on-one class. So here, so this is nefesh habamis. V'hanefesh halikis liyeshe sichli be'etzem. So the nefesh habamis is TV be'etzem. TV means natural, in this case, natural midas. Nefesh halikis, which is sichli be'etzem, is fundamentally an intelligent entity. It also has midas, but seichel is its dominant feature. Harihu b'chinas dakas v'ruchni. So therefore, the nefesh halikis is refined and ethereal or spiritual. So let me finish the paragraph. V'chein hu b'midas b'chlal, and same as with midas in general. Kishein rak mitzad hatva, when it's only due to hatva, meaning their natural wiring as they're embedded, ingrained within us. Besides the fact that they're drawn to lowly and crass things, meaning crass, meaning not refined, the very midah itself, not only what it's drawn to, the midah itself is an undeveloped and therefore in a very raw state. Which means once murgish comes into play, and the seichel develops, the emotions are only going to be directed toward more higher, loftier objectives, and they are, and things that are more refined, but also means the midas themselves will also be more refined because they're being directed to more refined things. So what's the conclusion from this? That after everything he said here, it's the same midas. We're born with a certain genetic structure, genetic emotional structure. Whether a chazdan, that does not change. Whether a person is drawn as a person, a naturally kind person, or someone who's not that kind, or a person who's all the different features he described, that doesn't change. And actually in the early stages, it's concealed. And even at a young age, you can see some of it develop. Good butzen, as he said, you could start seeing it. But what happens as the midas develop? The midas don't change, but they're directed to changes, and also how refined they will be. And that's the seichel. So the seichel is not creating a new midah. It's refining and polishing and producing a midah that is now going to be directed toward higher and greater things. So you have the seichel's impact, where in katnus, the seichel doesn't have much impact, if at all. And in gadlus, it does. And he gave the long example, how we see how seichel plays a role in how our emotions are attracted or repulsed by something, and how without seichel, you could end up something that and be something that really special and precious, and you won't be aware of it. You won't be drawn to it, I should say, because you're not aware. Or you could be near something that's frightening and not be aware. How seichel plays a role in this whole development of the emotions. So this is a pretty comprehensive analysis of how emotions grow and how emotions mature, with the role, and seichel's role indirectly has impact on that. But again, it does not change. In an animal, there's no seichel involved. So whatever an animal is wired, that's how they're wired. That's it. The human being, you can control and you can tame and you can harness the emotions. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or any comments? Because we're going to stop here.
What does it mean? הנפש הליקיס בבחינת הקטנוס נמשך אחר החומריות. The body, yes. You said before, I should not ask. I understand that about.
Because I explained it. Because while you were asking, I explained
the nefesh itself is not nimshach achar chomriyos. The nefesh bekatnos is not misgale guf. It's the guf nimshach chomriyos, but not the nefesh itself.
But the nefesh halikis is part of the person. So when a child, for example, gets angry and so on, the nefesh halikis is in the child. So what he means to say is that
he said this is the nefesh halikis or nefesh habamis. It's not the nefesh ben.
I heard that, and I'm responding to you. It says these words: that nefesh halikis, he says, b'chinas hakana shemidesav hemiraktivim. In other words, the nefesh halikis is not developed yet, so it's midesav. Its emotions are still natural ones. The nefesh halikis has not yet developed seichel in the person to direct the emotions. So what are the emotions of nefesh halikis? What do they follow? They're not just on the side. They're still directed by the midas of what the nefesh habamis is follow. Because the midas. What about the nefesh habamis right now? Make believe there's no nefesh habamis. The midas of the nefesh halikis themselves also need to mature. Even though they're nefesh halikis, but they're still childish. And they need also seichel to make them mature. So as long as the midas of nefesh halikis are not, now the nefesh halikis on its own would not necessarily be drawn to something crass.
Exactly.
But it would be drawn to something natural. Without seichel, it's drawn to whatever is in front of it. In other words, even if a person, think of the nefesh halikis, doesn't have seichel guiding it, so whatever is attracting the child's nefesh habamis, the nefesh halikis will follow along.
Okay, in the guf, not the nefesh itself. The nefesh itself is not
the human being. All this, everything here is the guf. Because if it's not the guf, you're talking about the neshama lamaila. There's no child, there's no adult.
Right.
The whole thing is about, we're talking about children and adults. The same reason a child does not get punished for an aved, also doesn't get schar for a mitzvah. Why? Why don't you say the nefesh halikis did a mitzvah? Because the child is not yet, in general, both its nefesh halikis and definitely nefesh habamis are not yet developed enough that you can say the child is doing it by its own volition. A child can do a lot of beautiful things, and we teach children to do beautiful things. Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? But it was a good question you're asking, by the way. It's a good question, because usually we think of nefesh halikis not being active yet. Here he's definitely saying that the midas, the word the diuk, hatkatnus b'chinas hakana shamidesav hemiraktivim nimshach achar. it's not so common that this is going to be said places. Usually we think of the nefesh elikis not yet active or emergent. Here he definitely says, so it's a very good point.
It's a little hard to understand. If the way you explain it, it makes sense. But he's talking here about the nefesh elikis itself. So nefesh elikis, nefesh ba'amis. And he said,
but he says nefesh elikis b'bchinas hakatnus. He clearly says the divine soul can be in a state of katnus. By the way, even in Gedalim, the nefesh elikis can be in a state of katnus, and at times like that, the nefesh elikis can also be trapped and directed in the wrong place. Listen, in Tanya, he says clearly in Perek Tes that the emotions of the heart can go up to the mind, and even take the nefesh elikis like sheichid ya'aver einei chachamim. What's happening? The nefesh habamis is influencing the mind of the nefesh elikis. That's what's happening. So nefesh elikis could also be trapped. Yes, it's true. The nefesh elikis be'etzem is not there. But think about it. That's why einei chachamim. We call them chachamim. A person has a nefesh elikis, everything is going, but he's biased. He took a bribe. He's meshuchet. So even the nefesh elikis will suddenly be distorted. The moyach itself of the chachamim and yisalev divrei tzadikim. That's a good example. It's not that nefesh elikis is silent.
That's interesting. Now you're saying a new thing. This is interesting what you say. Now you're saying a new thing, not before like it's a goof.
Because before I wasn't talking about a child, but I'm just giving an example. Even an adult, you can have a concept like that. You know, unfortunately, a Rov, that's meshuchet, he suddenly uses his taina shalteira, and so to speak, his nefesh elikis is also being used. Look, how many people use the Rebbe or God as a teretz for all kinds of things? You know, they're suddenly using that. Now, is it the be'etzem, the nefesh elikis? No, of course, the nefesh elikis is now begolus and beshivya. It's being held hostage. But just pointing out that's a much more extreme than we're talking here. Here he's definitely talking that the nefesh elikis it's al derech what it says in Tanya, that is made it reisha shel melech. You know, you have the power to do that. But here he's talking not so much that. Here he's talking more the development. It's clearly the nefesh elikis also goes through development stages. Like I said, knisas, tchilas knisas nefesh elikis, gemar knisas nefesh elikis. So clearly nefesh elikis, it's not in full glory. We have, remember, nefesh elikis resides in the moyach, in the mind, the seichel. And by a child, the nefesh elikis is not fully developed yet. So it's like a childish nefesh elikis, if you wish.
It's famous, the Rebbe Rashav, with the Rebbe Maharash about Reb Menachem Chernobyl, he said he never knew that there is a chassidischer nefesh habahamis. He didn't say nefesh elikis. That's
okay, because you could also have the other way, of course. Now, if the nefesh elikis, if a child did not have a nefesh habamis, you could say the nefesh elikis would not be able to be drawn to very sophisticated things. But probably will also not be drawn to hepech, to pure taivas. He says chumin is the nefesh habamis. It would then just be drawn to childish things, like I'm sure that the Rabbeim, as children, played games also. Doesn't mean there's something that was wrong, but I'm not talking about with the Rabbeim. It's a whole other story. Did they have a nefesh habamis at all or not? But that's another discussion. Okay, we're going to stop.
You brought up now a very powerful thing. You said that in the nefesh elikis itself, that's something that we have to think, because you see the Rebbe Rashab said that Frumer chassidischer nefesh habamis. So it's a question. It's really a question. Is the nefesh elikis sheichad ya'aver if he's talking about the nefesh elikis? That's a point.
I say also the nefesh elikis, because based on Tanya, what can happen is that the sheichad of the heart of the nefesh habamis could drag the nefesh elikis with it. And use the nefesh elikis for bad purposes. That's my point. Not that the nefesh elikis suddenly became a shuchid. Is the sheichid that distorts the mind, which should have been objective. Now, of course, the nefesh elikis could easily do something. It could say, "I recuse myself. I'm a negei b'davar." That would be the response. That's why. That's the whole machama, that you should not allow the sheichid to affect. But it could affect. It could affect even, that's what he says, but Pashtus and Tanya, Perek Tes, he says the blood of the dam of the nefesh habamis goes up to the mind, and it gives the mind also part of its justification. Anyway, let's stop here.
That's a mind, Simon, that's a mind. In practice, he's saying clearly that the nefesh elikis is not allowing anything. So
look at the piece where he says where the dam goes up to the mind, that affects the mind.
That's the goof. That's a goof. I don't know. That's a point to I didn't think about it.
Well, you never saw that a person with a good, healthy mind that comes from the nefesh elikis and everything is good, that suddenly becomes a negei b'davar, and suddenly that same mind that yesterday
could also be mishuchad.
No, it means that the nefesh habamis is taking control over the nefesh elikis. The nefesh elikis is now being held hostage, and the nefesh elikis. I didn't say nefesh elikis changed be'etzem, but for right now, it's following these midas. Anyway, it's a longer discussion. We can talk about it, how much it affects, how much it doesn't. We're going to stop here.